We do want to welcome you to the first ever Tamio webinar, and I'm Jay Warren, the Director of Communication and Legislative Affairs for the City of Arlington, and also your Tamio President. We are thrilled that so many of you signed up to participate in this and are logging in today to participate as well. And we've got both Tamio members with us, but we also extend this out to a larger audience of communicators and the municipal world throughout the state of Texas, and we welcome you all as well. You know, we're starting this monthly series with really one purpose in mind, and that is to make sure that we continue the education process throughout the year and not just keeping that to the conference that we have every single June. But we also want to make sure we're staying connected, and this is a great way for us to do it, and that we're hitting on some of those timely topics that we're all dealing with on a regular basis, day in and day out. Our topic today, frankly, could not be any more relevant: how cities listen and demonstrate understanding of residents' sentiments during crises. I don't know about you all, but I think often as a communicator, and I feel it all the time, we do a lot of one-way communication. We're talking at folks all the time on just regular issues and not necessarily talking with them and listening to them. And that's only amplified when you have something, a major issue going on in your community, like what we've all seen with the protests related to social justice. And how do we kind of harness all that energy? How do we listen to it? And how do we then turn that into something that can be a positive outcome for our communities? I think every one of us has dealt with that in some way. So this first topic for our first Tamio webinar, I think, is certainly perfect for that. I want to go through a couple of housekeeping items before we get to our presentation. First, we've left lots of Q&A time during this for you all. So please, in the Q&A section at the bottom of your Zoom screen, start sending those questions to us, and we'll be able to answer those, ask them and answer them of our speakers as we get toward the end of this hour-long session. Second, the best way for you to view this, so you can see the full screen but also see the speakers, is if you go up to the top, you can look at this at gallery view or speaker view. If you change that over rather to speaker view, that will be the best way for you to see all of their great slides and the content on them, but also be able to see the speakers at the same time. We are going to record this session, so we'll post it on our Tamio website, and we'll also be providing you with the slides. Don't feel like you have to take screenshots, which I've done before during webinars, or pull my camera out and take pictures of it. We'll get you the slides so that you can have those as well, particularly if you want to share them with other members of your teams or other members of your city administration or other communicators within your city, because this is going to be one of those topics that I think they're going to want to learn a lot about. Before we get to the speakers, though, we want to ask some poll questions, and this can help us kind of lay a good foundation of where we all are as we talk about social justice and equality in our communities. And our first question, if you guys will bring that up, is: have you ever had Black Lives Matter protests in your communities? Quick answer here, yes or no. We should be able to receive your results simultaneously as you all start voting. So let's see, and in fact, I'll vote as well, how many people are able to participate. Looks like we maybe have some technical difficulties with the poll questions, because I wasn't able to click on it either. So, you know, as I said, this is our first webinar. We may have some gremlins out there, so bear with us on that. Let us tweak on that. Maybe we'll ask these questions toward the end. And in fact, our speakers' presentations may actually help us even, I think, answer some of these questions perhaps even more accurately. So let's
Jay, I think the reason, Jay, you can't vote is because you're one of the hosts.
Oh,
so
okay.
Many people are able to vote, I think.
Are they? Okay. Well, I can't see the results. So you all, Jackie, can you see the results?
No.
Okay.
So far, 36 out of the 74 have been able to vote. So maybe we'll get those results a little bit later on.
Yeah, let's get the results to you all a little later. Oh, they're popping up now. Maybe there was just a delay. So look, 81% of Black Lives Matters protests have happened in your communities. That's a pretty high number, right? The second question there, did your city organization make a statement about Black Lives Matters back in May of 2020 over the course of the summer here? And it looks like we're fairly equal split, 44% yes, 56% no. And those numbers are tweaking a little bit as we go through this, and please continue to vote. Our third question from a polling standpoint is, has your community or police department instituted police changes related to the concerns and justice issues related to Black Lives Matter? And that, again, we're looking at a split, roughly about 48 to 52%. So seeing that kind of across the board. And then our fourth polling question, do spokespeople from your city, which include you as city manager or elected officials, coordinate statements to the community frequently for consistency, for tone and content in partnership with your police or public safety department? And again, we're getting a fairly mixed result here with looks like 80% currently saying yes, 43% saying no, or sometimes rather, and then only 9% saying no. So at least that looks, I think, encouraging that we're getting some interaction between our departments and we're not siloed, just the communications world and public safety in its own silos. So we appreciate you participating in those polls. I think that gives us a good backdrop for our transition now to our webinar with two fantastic speakers. And I'm not going to give a long introduction at their request because we really want to make sure we've got plenty of time for their presentation and also for you all to ask questions. So let me introduce to you two familiar faces and certainly friends of our TAMIO organization, Dr. Jackie Lambiase and Dr. Ashley Roberts. They are, English. They are both professors at the Bob Schieffer College of Communications, Strategic Communication Department. One of them, of course, that is one of the premier communication schools throughout America. Dr. Lambiase is the creator and the director of the CPC program that many of you have either probably thought about attending or have attended over the course of the last 5 or 6 years that has been offered. And of course, Dr. English has been an advisor to that program, a collaborator and an instructor, and both have been presenters at our annual conference. So I know they are familiar faces to all of you. I would describe them as communication rock stars, as certainly in municipal communication, but also I think as we look at communication from an inclusivity and in a diverse way. And they are the perfect folks to really present this research that is brand new research to all of us as we are grappling with a lot of these issues in our community. So with that, the abbreviated introduction, let me pass it off to Jackie and Ashley. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jay, and I'll get us started. I just want to thank TAMIO for the opportunity to present and talk with you all about such an important topic. Thank you, Jay and Lauren. I think maybe Dorothy White had a hand in this as well. So we appreciate the opportunity always to talk with and work with TAMIO communicators and anybody else who's joining this webinar right now. I also want us to, I'm just going to kind of, okay. Okay, so it did work. Sorry. It kind of froze on me for a minute, so I panicked. Ashley and I did a webinar last fall in which everything froze, so I'm waiting for that to happen now. So some objectives for the webinar are just to figure out how we can listen well. How do we do this better, and what kind of foundation do we need to do that well? How can we find connections between listening and actual actions, not just statements, but actions, and how do we infuse that throughout a culture of our whole city? We're going to present some information that Ashley has been working on all year with some of our graduate students about the case itself and the killing of Tatiana Jefferson. And then we'll have some takeaways at the end for you that are some actions you can do right now to build a foundation and to get to work to get some of these good things done. And first, I just want to start with some quick reflections. One is, of course, we want to think about Tatiana Jefferson and her dear family. Since her death and killing, several other members of her family have passed away. It's a tragedy of Shakespearean size. And so we never want to forget her or her family and the agony and horror that they've been put through since October 12th of 2019. We'll talk about that case in a bit. We want to use that hashtag say her name, and we want to honor her here. Also, this week is the 7th anniversary of Black Lives Matter. And so that organization has been telling us things we need to hear for 7 years, and yet there's been little action. And so we need to change that. I want to talk about a professional that I've worked with here in the state of Texas who talked to me about the experience of working through COVID-19 and racial justice and some of the issues that have come up over the last 4 months. And one of the things he told me was that they have failed the stress test. He felt like his city failed the stress test because they didn't have enough relationships and they didn't have enough in the bank in order to help them do the outreach that they needed to do. And so we know that community engagement and relationship building are key. And a lot of this presentation will focus on those two concepts, community engagement and relationship building. Everything you do should tie into those two things. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. And we also want to just say hi to any friends from the city of Fort Worth who might be on this call. We work with City of Fort Worth communicators. TCU is based in Fort Worth. We have a lot of respect for them. This is really a case study about the total city effort and how to get better, and not so much a criticism of them. We know that these problems are complex and they're in every place, every city. And so this is certainly not meant as an arrow in their heart by any means. We want to help everybody get better, and we are part of that community as well. We're doing work at TCU that we hope will help the broader city of Fort Worth, so we're involved as well. We want to start with the framework, and you're going to start with just a little bit of theory so that we get a great underpinning or foundation for the things that we're going to talk about today. One is just the listening imperative. All these things have to do with listening, and we're going to give you some quick theoretical standpoints that you can use to think about this and to lead conversations, to build better culture. So the first thing we learned from listening to people in the community was you've got to listen, but not just listen, but listen for needs, okay? We know that listening is one of the most overlooked leadership skills, and people and organizations both are very bad at it. So let's start there. We're going to talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is one of my favorite theories for communication. And if we think about, for instance, the George Floyd incident of May, if we look at it through the lens of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's a heartbreaker all the time, but especially here. If Black people can't feel safe psychologically and can't get air, nothing else is going to happen. They can't thrive. And so, you know, when we think about this hierarchy, when we talk about justice, peace, and those types of things, ethics, that moves us up higher into this hierarchy. But those two basic layers have to happen first, or nothing else can happen. And so that middle layer, that social layer, the need for love, belonging, and inclusion is something that Black people have been wanting for a long time, and we haven't, as white people, given it to them. And so this is a good way to start conversations around this topic, I think, in our listening. But the first kind of major communication theory I want to talk about is the contingency theory of conflict management. And very quickly, it's basically the priorities of an organization versus the values in its environment. And so we want to think about this push and pull between advocacy and accommodation. These are common topics in public relations, for instance. And so advocacy can look like we're just speaking up for our organization, but oftentimes I see advocacy as an organization fighting to be right instead of trying to have a say and also listen. And so we want to make sure that we are closer to the accommodation end of this continuum. And that doesn't mean just that we're open. It means that we are open to change. And so that's going to be very necessary to the type of listening we're going to talk about today. Scholars talk about this type of negotiation, this type of balancing act between advocacy and accommodation. It's a multifaceted, it's a complicated process. But what it does is it's to help meet divergent needs of stakeholders. And it relies on extensive communication. It can't be a statement. It has to be an ongoing effort that is complex and difficult. It requires substantial management attention. So the city manager has to be involved in it. The police chief and other people who are in management positions have to spend a lot of time on this. The takeaway is you can do things in the world, your city can, but people have to see them and discuss them. You have to reveal it to them, and you have to have a lot of planning and a lot of time. Your job is to recognize the needs as you listen and then get those needs in front of the people who can make the policy changes to make a difference. Your job is using assembled words and dialogue to do that, but the change has to happen within your organization as well. And that's very tough. It requires you to take on not just a communicator role, but a leadership communication role. The second theory that I want to spend a couple minutes on is just these are theories of public relations. And oftentimes, as Jay said at the beginning of this webinar, you know, we spend a lot of time on the output part or the press agency model or the public information model instead of spending time in the dialogue part. So the better one, of course, is dialogue. The goal for that always is outcome. It is not output of a number of messages that we've done or a number of pressers that we've held or the number of town halls that we've done or how much content we have on our website or how much we're interacting with people in social spaces. We have to have a lot of dialogue, and that's all outcome based. As much as we can, ideally, we want to be pushing always towards symmetrical two-way communication, which is very difficult. The mashup between the contingency theory and these PR models is this: output doesn't matter, only outcome matters, and it's hard. Community outcomes happen because of the space of dialogue, not the line of communication, not the line of an announcement. So putting out announcement after announcement, this is something that's been happening at TCU, and our internal stakeholders are pretty upset about it right now. I mean, we had another meeting yesterday in which, you know, it was pretty hot. And so these statements, they don't mean anything. Only action will mean something. And so until action happens, the statements just, you might as well leave them on the side and get the dialogue done. Symmetry requires that you meet in the spaces of others, you meet on their timetables and clocks. You've got your 3-minute clock in those council meetings. Well, that's BS, right? I mean, that's just something we do. We have to meet on other people's clocks. We have to be more than 3-minute listeners. And so I'm challenging you to do that, and everybody within your city to do that. The last theory I'm going to talk very quickly about is dialogic theory, which is a huge, complicated theory. And I've tried to kind of scale it back a little bit. There's some relational pieces that have to do with positive regard, mutual equality, and relationship building. There's another model that has a whole bunch of pieces in it, but the parts of this model that I want to focus on, first of all, are empathy and also risk. You have to be vulnerable. There will be unintended consequences, and some of those will be good. And you have to recognize that others are not in the same place as you or your bubble. And so the evidence of listening is action, and even better, change. Listening equals change and action, and listening and action and change also equal caring. So those are some takeaways from the theoretical standpoints that I wanted to share. And now Ashley's going to start talking about the case itself.
All right, so thanks for that great framework, Jackie. High five from a distance. There we go. So in the chat, since it's there, folks, if I were in person, I would ask you to reflect on what you heard so far and what you've learned. So feel free in the chat to just talk about something that resonated with you or some idea that you connected really well with that you can go forward with from Jackie's perspective. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the incident, and I'll try to go as quickly as possible without talking at 100 miles an hour. But I want to send a special thanks to Kinzer, Olivia, and McKenna, who are grad students who helped us on this project. So on October 12th, a Fort Worth resident, James Smith, contacted the city of Fort Worth around 2:23 a.m. using 311 to request a wellness check on his neighbor. Tatiana Jefferson, her mom, and her nephew were at home, and the lights were on, the front door was open, the car was in the driveway, and Mr. Smith felt that this was not normal behavior for them and just wanted to have a check. 2 minutes later, 2 officers from the Fort Worth Police Department arrived on the scene. Neither announced themselves when they arrived. They looked through the front door, did not see anything, moved to the backyard. In the backyard, former officer Aaron Dean paused at the rear window. He saw Tatiana Jefferson's face through the window and shouted, "Put your hands up, show me your hands," and shot her through the window almost immediately after issuing those commands. Before she was shot, she was playing video games with her 8-year-old nephew, Zion. And according to Zion, the two heard noises outside, and Jefferson grabbed her legally owned handgun from her purse and peered out the bedroom window to see what was going on outside. Seconds later, she was shot by Dean. The police entered the home and provided emergency medical care, and they also called MedStar at 2:36 a.m. This all happened in about a 13-minute time span. And but Jefferson's wounds, unfortunately, were fatal, and she was pronounced dead on the scene. This 28-year-old woman, pre-med graduate of Xavier University, living at home to take care of her mom and her nephew, was gone. This sparked outrage from many. And to really understand the outrage, not just on the face of the details, but also we have to look at this in the context of social movements. So police brutality and Black Lives Matter movement are essential to understanding the community's response to this. So the Black Lives Matter movement was sparked in 2013 when Alicia Garza used the hashtag Black Lives Matter to respond to George Zimmerman's acquittal. And so Zimmerman was the man who shot and killed 17-year-old Trayvon Martin, an unarmed Black teenager, in February of 2012. And so this movement was essentially aimed at highlighting the challenges that Black people face in America from state-sanctioned violence and anti-Black racism. And this movement has since grown to a global network of more than 40 chapters seeking to address systemic racism and important issues. And this movement gained additional momentum with national outcries from the public from this summer related to issues connected to Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. Particularly, Floyd's death was traumatizing and shocking to the world as we all watched a man literally dying right in front of us for nearly 10 minutes, having a knee on his neck, crying out that he couldn't breathe and crying out for family. So it's important to recognize that this movement, and especially our recent events of this summer, have changed American perceptions about the police. In a recent poll, Americans increasingly view police as disproportionately violent to Black people. And so we'll see on this next chart.
I'm sorry, Ashley, I'm trying to get it to progress.
It's okay. There are some slides here with statistics about the change, but it's essentially the American public overall, adults, have increased nearly 12% in their belief that the police do disproportionately impact Black people from a violent standpoint. And this is across a number of demographic groups as well. Additionally, there are statistics about the public perception of the way the criminal justice system treats police who injure or kill civilians. And so the perception overall is that the police are treated far too leniently in these types of situations. And this is not just a perspective of Black Americans, but all Americans. Additionally, when asked about how serious the problem of police violence against the public is, nearly 80% of Americans believe the problem of police violence is an issue, with slightly less than 50% saying this is an extreme issue or extreme problem or seriously an issue that we need to address. So with this national backdrop in mind of perceptions about the police, let's look a little bit closer now and drill down into the city of Fort Worth. So Fort Worth is the 13th largest city in the United States. It is a majority minority city, meaning over half of the residents in Fort Worth identified not as non-Hispanic white. And so this is in contrast to the leadership of the city of Fort Worth. So 65% of the police force is white. The mayor, the city manager, and the majority of the city council and the police chief are also white. So this could create some distance in understanding and perceptions. Then as we look closely into the city of Fort Worth and look at the Fort Worth Police Department, we also can see some contextual issues that matter. So there is a history of repeated involvement in high-profile incidences in Fort Worth related to violent mistreatment and excessive force toward Black people. One national incident that caught the attention of many was involving Jackie Craig, a Black woman who was having a dispute with a white neighbor. Both of them called 911. The officer who responded only addressed Jackie Craig. It resulted in her being pinned on the ground and put in handcuffs. And the nature of the call was that the neighbor, according to Craig, grabbed her 8-year-old son's neck and pushed him down. So she was calling as a mother concerned and ended up being in handcuffs. This caught national attention and prompted the city council to create a task force on race and culture in 2017 to talk about these issues within the community. So in 2018, they did a number of community conversations sponsored by the Task Force on Race and Culture. And they found in their community conversations that the perception that the city was doing little or nothing to improve race relations, racial equity, and cultural awareness. They also found the need to continue to expand and deepen community conversations about race and culture and to clarify measurable outcomes. To Jackie's point, the actions that should be coming out of these conversations. So that resulted in 22 recommendations to fix issues related to diversity across the city, not just the police department, but housing policies, health issues, and a number of other areas. Another issue that was difficult for the Fort Worth Police Department was 2019 itself. It was a deadly year for the police department. And so they had 9 officer-involved shootings, 7 of which were fatal, and 6 of those were Black people. So we can see just the context of these issues are very challenging from the beginning. So now let's look at some of the spokespersons involved here. We have the City of Fort Worth spokespersons, and the 3 we focused on were Mayor Betsy Price, Police Chief Ed Kraus, and City Manager David Cook. So when we look at the pre-crisis, so before 2012, I alluded to some of those issues in my summary of the context, but the goal of the pre-crisis phase is to help organizations from a risk management perspective to think about crises that could happen and mitigate those. There were many signs that Fort Worth was at high risk for a police-involved shooting issue like what happened with Atatiana Jefferson. The Black Lives Matter movement was in full steam ahead. We have this history of fatal shootings in the police department, as well as task force recommendations saying these things. And then also data on police shootings indicate that cities that are majority minority cities with large populations are more likely to have these events happen. So the city just really needed to be ready for something like this and already taking action to prevent. So in the actual crisis itself, we deemed that time period from October 12th to October 17th. There was a slow response from the leaders. According to research, an organization's initial response should be quick in a crisis. It should be quick, accurate, consistent, and express concern or sympathy for victims involved. In this case, Atatiana was shot around 2:30 in the morning, and the Fort Worth Police Department did not release a statement until just after noon that day, which created a lot of opportunity for people to talk and express their concerns and to promote protest and frustration, honestly. And there was inconsistent use and frequency of social media, and we'll talk about that subsequently. The content of the messages was inconsistent among the spokespersons. And on October 14th, there was a joint press conference that all 3 spokespersons participated in, and each pronounced Atatiana's name differently and incorrectly. And just that small detail conveyed a lack of concern and a lack of empathy to not even know how to pronounce the victim's name. And then also there were some inaccurate messages throughout this crisis response about how the investigation would be handled. Fort Worth Police Department said an internal investigation would happen. Mayor Price later said that the city would be hiring an outside agency to investigate the department's policies. The next day, the police chief continued to talk about an internal investigation while the city manager and the mayor talked about third-party investigation. It just opened up a lot of concerns and questions about if this would even be handled properly. Also, on the night of October 12th, when the shooting took place, the Fort Worth Police Department released pictures of Atatiana Jefferson's gun in the home. And that immediately sparked concerns for the community that this was in some way an attempt to blame the victim for being shot in her own home, despite the fact that the gun was legally owned and the police officers did not identify themselves. And I think it's important to note here as well, this is on the heels of a police officer involved shooting in Dallas with Botham Jean, and the officer had just been sentenced the week before the shooting happened. So it's a similar situation. And in that case, there was some attempts to shame the character of Botham Jean with pictures of marijuana being on the premises. And the community was sensitive to this tactic. And so Chief Krause and Mayor Price later called those photos irrelevant and said that they never should have been released in the first place. And then also with the crisis response, each spokesperson did emphasize the need for transparency and seeking justice. So they did reflect that cry from the community to understand that the community did not feel safe and did not trust them. Post-crisis, there were some corrective actions that were instituted by the city. One was to call for the independent review of the Fort Worth Police Department. Another was to create 2 positions to help institutionally to address these issues. So the creation of a diversity and inclusion director role, as well as a police monitor position. While those actions were great, there was a lack of update on the progress and outcomes of those actions. So in November, after the shooting, City Manager Cook shared the names of national experts that would serve on that independent review panel, but provided no updates about when they would start and what they were doing. Also, the city manager and the mayor talked about the public forum where the candidates for the police monitor position would take questions and so forth, but only the mayor provided an update as to who was actually hired for the position and her credentials. The same was in the same situation happened for the first diversity and inclusion director as well. So once she was hired, only Mayor Price was the one to acknowledge that. Fort Worth Police Department actually made no comments on corrective action. The only comments and statements that they made were during the actual incident. So when we look at their coordination of communication, we can see mostly a lack of collaboration, which is really in alignment with some of the statistics we saw in the polls as well that I just looked at for this group. So there was only one joint appearance. That was the news conference on the 14th. That was the only time the city manager spoke on the issue, and he spoke with the rest of the group, not independently about the incident. He did talk about corrective action and new department positions, but did not address the actual shooting itself. The Fort Worth Police Department focused only on the shooting and didn't provide post-crisis communication. And the mayor did communicate during the crisis and after, but most of those statements were just relaying statements from the police department and so forth. However, Mayor Price was the only one to offer statements of support for the other leaders and their efforts. So she acknowledged their communication efforts and sought to bolster their efforts as well. So then when we look at their digital versus traditional communication channels, traditional efforts included briefings, news conferences, public statements. When we looked at their social media presence, we saw some differences. So Twitter was used most by all of the, well, for most of the spokespersons, Twitter was the preferred route. Fort Worth PD was most active here. And again, those messages featured organizational statements and so forth, but they did not mention corrective action. On Instagram and Facebook, those were underutilized platforms, especially considering that some of the protests and so forth were among younger people in the city who tend to go toward Instagram more so, and Facebook allows you to add more details on your communication efforts, but those were underutilized. And even when the spokespersons used social media, it felt more like copy and paste to take this from one place to the next. So on the next slide, we can see examples of their social media communication where the use of captions are not really used here to help quickly convey the nature of the content to social media users who are often skimming and looking for quick detail and quick information. So we see the Fort Worth Police Department news conference 1014. No reference to Tatiana Jefferson, no reference to reform, no reference to justice, just a news conference. You could easily miss this if you weren't looking for it. And also the officer involved shooting part. So those are all just challenges. If we use social media, we have to adapt to the platform. So next, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the public's response. Overall, there was a sense of a lack of trust in the police department. as echoed by activists in the community, this idea of the police policing the police is problematic for most people in the community. And so that was a sentiment that was felt. Residents also wanted the city to acknowledge that this is a systemic racism issue. The inability to say the words systemic racism, that this is a part of the problem, when the city commissioned a task force who said those same things. That language is not coming into the rhetoric of the city, the police department, or the mayor to address these types of situations, and it fuels a level of frustration from the community. Also, a person from the business community highlighted the fact that the city needs to work hard with other civic leaders and educational leaders to solve these issues. I don't think the city residents expect the city to solve all of the problems. They expect for the city to involve the right stakeholders who can help craft the right solutions. And so also this a quote from a resident from the public comment period said, "Back up the pretty words in your letter with meaningful action." This summarizes Jackie's comments perfectly. We are writing very eloquent statements and not doing very much in terms of reforms and changes, which makes our communication, even if it is eloquently worded, hollow effort.
I'm going to share some provisional insights that we've gained by talking to a lot of stakeholders within the city of Fort Worth. And very quickly, one of the things that we heard was listening for the need and not just talking and hearing. Cities must weigh in when things are happening. And so if you don't weigh in, it comes across as not caring. Younger Black people may have different ideas than their elders do, and so we must include them in the conversations and listening and in dialogue. That during some of the more recent protests, because we started this project in late 2019, and then a lot of things have happened since then. So in some of these interviews, we ended up talking about things that are happening now. So one of the things that came up was that the police kind of, corralled a bunch of demonstrators on the West 7th Street bridge to keep them from going to the white or affluent part of the city. And so that they were trying to control where they had their say. Many people have talked about, if your last name is Bass, people listen to you, or if you are the police association, you have the most power. One of the people that we talked to said that the city communicates with residents through condescension and punitive measures. They tell us what they're going to do, and then they report it to us. They said it depends on who owns the business, who they listen to. That these race and culture forums were publicized within water bills, which is kind of a passive way to get the word out. And then at the same time, if you don't pay your water bill, someone from the city will come out in person and cut your water off, but they will not come out in person and talk with you or listen to you. And so those were some things that we got. And that, the idea, the continuing problem with many police forces is that the good cops won't talk about the bad cops. And that the police officers and their families were seen as more important than a Tatiana Jefferson and her family. Those were some things that we heard and some of the listening that we've been doing. 5 things you can do right now before we get to our Q&A. Here's a quick list. And again, as Jay said at the beginning, we're going to be sharing this slideshow with all of you. So if we can't get to all this stuff right now, you're going to get a copy of this as a participant of this webinar, and we can talk in the Q&A about it. One thing we recommend is just diversify, intensify, and scrutinize with your team. Who's on your team? Who were your last 3 or 4 hires? Do you need more people of color on your team, or do you have any? Who can informally join your team now to help you with this work? What about your external partners? You need to intensify your relationships with them. If you're working with Black, Indigenous, or people of color groups that represent those people, are you engaged with the same ones over and over? One of the people that we interviewed said to us, you can't keep going to the Black church to understand Black people. They're part of how you understand, but you need more than that. You can't go back to the same groups you've been going to for years. you need to diversify and intensify your work with outside partners. And you need to take a look at your past work to make your future work better. If you have had oversights, omissions, and neglect, those are all forms of racism. If you're using only English in your messaging, that is seen as a form of oppression. It basically says we don't care about you enough to communicate with you in your home language. So those are things that you can look at right now and make quick changes, we hope. You need to take a look at your city's history of listening to and serving communities of color. You have to reflect on this, and white people have to do the work. It can't just be asking Black employees to carry this load. Everybody needs to be involved, and especially whites. You need to acknowledge those problems. We saw a statement earlier this week from the city of Asheville, North Carolina, about reparations and reform. That's the kind of thing we're talking about here. Acknowledging your past, acknowledging the history, and talking about and benchmarking the ways that you're going to get better, and trying to stay away as much as you can from those statements and performative activism. We want to talk about resident participation planning. This is a model that I picked up from Will Hampton, who's from the city of Round Rock. We've kind of added to it a little bit here in terms of how do you work with getting consent and getting agreement and getting compromise in these large community conversations. And this is just a list of all the things you can do and all the people that need to be included. And it's the beginning of a list. There'll be other things you'll want to add to this list. Again, to go back to some stuff I said at the very beginning, please focus on outcomes and not output. Every communication goal that you have, every objective, strategy, and tactic, they all should be tied to ways that build new community engagement, not just the same suspects over and over again, the same people have been involved, but new people, new relationship building efforts and partnerships, and of course, listening, action, solutions, and change. And then this 5 is a 3-part kind of recommendation to you. Embrace empathetic listening. There is no them, there is only us. I know how hard it is for me to ask you to think about this, but I became a much better college professor when I began to love every single student where they were and try to help them. And you need to do that with the community as well. You've got to develop responsive listenership and leadership. And these are some of the components of that. And in addition to listening, reflection, and action, you've got to have empathy, friendliness, compassion, all those things that work with daily communication. And the last thing here is to be responsive. It's risky again, and it requires you and others to lay down power and control. There will be things that you can't control. There will be things that are outcomes that you didn't want, but that are better for the community. And you need to listen to that. And then the last piece is this model that we worked on with one of our graduate students called the Active Empathetic Listening Model. And she did an audit of social media spaces and the ways that cities across the country show that they're listening within social channels. And there are 4 ways of doing that. One is pertinent response, one is elaboration, one is advice, opinion, perspective, one is answering and asking questions. There's a few bullet points here to help you get better at this. And one of the things we know about this is you need multiple strategies. So you need all 4 of these strategies. You can sometimes make it fun and use memes and things like that, or emojis. And you also have to be human and acknowledge and address the feelings that people are putting in your social media spaces. And now we are open for questions and answers. And we wanted to share our email addresses and our Twitter handles if you wanted to communicate with us during that forum. But Jay's going to help us with some Q&A right now.
Well, Jackie and Ashley, that was a fantastic presentation and really spot on with what I think so many of us are dealing with day in, day out, over the course of this summer. We've gotten a couple of questions already, but I would encourage folks to continue to send those in. I know it's a lot to digest and this is a heavy topic, but we'd love to hear more. One of our questions reads, you mentioned doing more on Instagram to reach a younger audience. And it's obviously extremely engaged in our national protests and a strong desire to create change and end systemic racism. Any recommendations for social media, video, or website content pieces that can create impactful dialogue? And how do we know that we're actually reaching those right audiences on social media?
I'll start, and then it looks like Ashley has something she wants to say too. So I think that what you have to do is actually elevate and amplify the messages of those in the community. And so what that means is, it may not mean that you're coming up with a whole lot of original content on your own, although you'll need to do that, and you'll need to develop social cards and those kinds of things. But what it also means is that you need to work with partners in your community and share their content. And I know that that's been a hard thing for cities to do. And so in social media spaces, you don't want to look like you're promoting other businesses, but not some businesses, but not other businesses. I mean, I know that that's fraught with difficulty, but I think that you could help amplify the right kind of messages that other people are putting in those spaces, and then talk about the ways the city is going to work on that issue. So in other words, if a local organization posts something like, silent allies are not allies, your city could repost that in Instagram and then also place comments about the ways that you're trying to not be silent and the ways that you are speaking out. And that would be one recommendation, I think, is work with those local partners and build them up, and that would help you too.
Yeah, I just agree with that as well. Working with local partners who have already showed you a vested interest in the cause. And because I know one of the concerns is maybe the motive of the community group. And in some cases, you're not sure if the motive of the group is to embarrass the city or if it's to work towards legitimate change and so on and so forth. But there are already organizations that are working in these spaces that have demonstrated a true commitment to equality and to social justice and to improving racial equity. So just start working with those first to amplify their message because you know their credibility. But then I think there's a big portion of social media that actually happens offline. One of the things I'm consistently hearing from younger people is stop with the show. You're doing the show. And a lot of the Instagram posts and the reposting and even the amplification of community messages can come across as insincere and cheap. So one step might be working with influencers on those social platforms and talking with them about what are their concerns for the city. How can you work together to reach their audience, to get younger voices in? What do we need to do differently? I think it starts with what we're saying right now, which is listening. You have to listen first. And I think so often we want to listen for about 2 seconds and post something. And with a lot of these deeper issues, you have to show your authenticity with action. And for some organizations, the action is actually the direct conversation versus trying to have a conversation in a social space when there is no authentic relationship. This generation, Gen Z, millennials, they're over it. And so they are tired of the profession of values when they're not really seeing the action. So I think you start by talking to those influencers. And then as far as what metrics and so forth to use and to look for, I think you first have to know who you want to talk to and who you want to engage. Then you determine, are you reaching those people versus just looking at overall general engagement.
We have another question is, what is the best balance? This person wrote in, we had a large group of young Black Lives Matters protesters that showed up to City Hall, and they had a list of demands. And some of our leadership didn't want to meet with them for fear that that would set a precedent that we respond to threats. And we saw a little bit of this. I don't know how many of you saw the Minneapolis mayor who was in the middle of a rally, and they were really peppering him at the time with kind of their list of threats, or threats less so than maybe demands. How do you balance all that?
I would say that the reason that people are issuing demands is because they haven't been heard. And so, I mean, I think you have to flip that on its head and say the reason that they're coming here with so-called demands, I mean, one way to reframe that for your leadership and for your council and to encourage them to talk to these groups is to call demands, they're simply needs. Like, I need this to happen in my community to feel safe. I need this to happen in my community because there hasn't been social justice or there have been brutal police involved shootings of innocent Black people. And I mean, the setting the precedent thing is just lame, I think, Jay. I don't buy it at all, because I think it's not like there's so many groups walking into City Hall and wanting to talk to people. It just doesn't happen. When somebody walks in and wants to talk, you should talk with them. And you may have to find the right person. I would say on my own campus right now, there are definitely people that our student groups should not talk to because they can't do the language right. They don't know the language of anti-racism. They don't know how to handle it. You know, as recently as 2016 or 2017, Betsy Price was quoted as saying, "I didn't realize there was this much racial divide in Fort Worth," when a group was presenting her that information. And I mean, she hadn't done the right work yet. So she was not a good person to have. She should have been listening to that conversation. She should have been included. She should have been present. But maybe there's somebody else who can start the dialogue. If you just keep at stalemate, that's why we're here. We're here because people won't listen. People feel threatened by demands when they're simply needs.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've got to reframe that.
Yeah, and I think it's about mirroring your person. So with the Black Lives Matter protesters that came in with the demands, I think you start by acknowledging, first of all, running away from the conversation is not helping. So when you don't show up for the conversation, that makes the issue worse. But you come and you hear what they are saying. And part of this goes back to our recommendation of knowing your organizational history. If your organization has a history of neglecting a certain population, you have to come to that conversation acknowledging that misstep. And that's not saying we are doing everything incorrectly, but it's acknowledging we understand we haven't met the needs of this part of our community well. So thank you for coming here to help us understand ways that we can do this better. I think when you just address the elephant in the room, sometimes that disarms people. And you, again, to Jackie's point, you have to have the right personalities in those meetings. And so maybe that means somebody on the comms team gets trained in conflict resolution, whether maybe that's alternative dispute resolution expertise. Like, bring in people who are not afraid of conflict and can help people move to a place of consensus. And sometimes that means tapping into the resources that somebody else has who know how to facilitate dialogue. Everyone cannot facilitate dialogue. All communicators are not naturally wired to facilitate dialogue. So I think it means widening your scope of resources and partnerships and recognizing I need an expert who knows how to have really hard conversations. And if you bring that person in, I think those will be much more fruitful. And it's not a taking over, but a lot of this energy that we see from protesters is just a lot of hurt and neglect and feeling that I've tried to use all of the channels and nobody's listening.
Actually, I think you're so right on that one point of we so often are not willing to admit as a government body that either we made a mistake or that we're not perfect or that we could do better. And the minute you do that, you do disarm things, and it can lead to a better conversation, a better back and forth that you would not have otherwise had. We've got about 5 more minutes. And we've got about 6 questions yet to get to. I'm going to try and get through these quickly. Each of our organizations is required to have a crisis comm plan, but this is not your typical crisis communications like we think about a train derailment or something along those lines. What would you recommend in those circumstances when you've got something like this? How do you prepare for it? How do you plan for it when this is not your typical crisis?
I want to go back to what something Ashley said about conflict resolution. I think you need to build that into your plan and it's really a conflict management theory, conflict management cycle. And so go do some research on that theory because it would help you a lot. And contingency theory is part of conflict management theory. And so that is a new piece, I think, in the crisis communication toolbox that you're going to need.
When your community, another question, when your community is almost 80% white, non-Hispanic and conservative, which certainly could represent a lot of rural Texas in a way, what are some of the ways that we can make BIPOC people feel listened to or represented in the messaging?
I think you're going to have to start with relationship building first. It's got to be relationship building first. And whether it's individuals that you call in, I'm a big fan of focus groups. And now, I mean, Zoom focus groups, but having places where you can actually talk to people about their experiences. To Jackie's point about going out into the community and talking to people where they are. So often I think we want people to come to us to tell us how to reach them, as opposed to going to them directly. And finding out in those communities, there are always some community leaders. There are always some community unifiers in these spaces that serve as bridge builders. Find those people and talk to them about their concerns, and they will help you find the best ways to move forward, especially if you're starting to reach those communities for the very first time. I just want everybody on this Zoom today to avoid the promotional communication dilemma. And in this space with inclusion and conversations around social justice and making people feel more included and they can show up as their full selves, it is not something that you're publicizing. And as you publicize it, you take away from the good, authentic effort. And when you have the council meeting that goes to the underserved area of the community and takes all these pictures and posts them on social media, look, I came by, it just does not foster what you think is fostering in those communities. It's best to do it first in person and in relationship, and then move to a public communication about it.
Many of our issues have become politicized, mask wearing as an example. How do you work with city leaders to find the right balance between messaging and also convincing them that this isn't a political issue?
You have to know your history. When you know your history and why and how certain communities and people have been treated over time, it gives you evidence to say, this is not for right now. This is about the history of how this group has been treated in our community, and we're trying to right that. But if it's just right now focused on the numbers, then yes, it's going to seem political. Jackie?
I don't have an answer for that, Jay. That's a tough one. I mean, everybody's dealing with it. Find the grown-ups in the room and use them. And then if you can neutralize people who are doing the wrong thing just to get them to be quiet, that's probably your best bet, and to amplify the voices of people who are doing the right thing, which is wearing masks, you know, so that we can have school this fall, you know, and so we can educate young people. I mean, we can't put bars and Six Flags over that. So you've got to figure that out, I think. Find the grown-ups and see if you can sideline the other people.
This is one more question, and then we'll kind of wrap up. Along the lines of balance, what do you do as a city to cope with people that want to support the police department and make sure that they aren't all categorized as racist, but also see the importance and value of supporting the Black Lives Matter movement, like that kind of balance? How do you do that?
You frame the conversation not as an either or, but a both and. It's a both and. We support the police, but we also recognize, look at the stats that I share with you. People have a perception about the police. And it's not the flawless perception that we've had in the past, that maybe some have had in the past. And so we have to reconcile the fact that there's an issue with excessive use of force. There's an issue there, especially towards communities of color. So let's just acknowledge that and let's fix that. But let's still support our public safety officers. And let's try to take some of the weight off of them to do social services and other things that they're not qualified to do. Let's take the weight off so they can focus on public safety. But it's not an either or. It's not Black Lives Matter or the police. It's both and, because we're all in the same community.
And one quick thing I would say about this, here's some additional resources. And the first one on this list is, you know, I've seen a lot of police recruiting videos for communities across Texas that don't have all these openings in the police department. And there are these videos where you're recruiting warriors, but you're not recruiting guardians. I think that's also part of the communication piece. And there was an excellent op-ed in earlier this week in the Dallas Morning News, and I've put the link here. Part of it is reframing what the police are supposed to do. And that's part of that both and thing that Ashley's talking about, which is, yeah, they're public safety officers, and every once in a while they might have to be a warrior, but I think we want to also reframe what their job is. And I think many people get into policing to be a guardian. Let's emphasize again the good stuff and also root out the bad. We audit city books and financial stuff. The police need it too. Every entity needs an audit, and we haven't done enough of that.
Well, Ashley and Jackie, both, thank you so much. If we could give you a standing ovation, I think we probably all would right now, as you normally receive at one of our Tamio conferences. This has been a really great conversation, and it's a topic that is impacting all of us, and we're grappling with it right now. So this type of information helps us, I think, all as we move forward, and hopefully really reach some consensus in our community through listening. So I can't thank you enough for sharing your research and for being a part of our very first Tamio webinar. Let me thank all the folks who participated. We have over 80 that were online with us today, which is fantastic. As I mentioned, we're planning on doing this monthly now. So folks, look to your email here in the next few weeks about what we'll be doing in August. In the meantime, you'll get a survey. We'd love to get your feedback on this topic, about other topics you'd like to hear about, and how we can do this better to better serve you and keep the conversation and keep the learning going over the course of the year until we see you at our next conference. But again, Jackie and Ashley, thank you so much. We'll be putting up their both this presentation as well as their PowerPoint on our website if you'd like to look at it more or share it with some of your colleagues. Until next time, until our next webinar, thanks everyone for signing up, and we'll see you hopefully in about a month.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Tamio. Thank you for all you do for all of us. You're so important.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.